Welcome to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast, where you can learn and be inspired by real-world examples of how technology is transforming businesses and reshaping industries in a language everyone can understand. Here is your host, Neil C. Hughes.
Welcome back to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast. Now, many of you will remember that we have tackled the world of legal tech many times, and we finally eradicated the myth that the legal profession are slow to adapt to technological change. We can retire that notion once and for all. But I think as consumers and business leaders, it has now become us that don't understand the legal implications of that latest shiny new tech solution that we roll out. For example, if I was to say, what do you know about Dentons? I suspect that you would say they're the world's largest law firm. But I suspect you wouldn't associate them with autonomous cars. And Dentons has recently released a new report called The Global Guide to Autonomous Vehicles in 2020, which essentially takes a look at the top issues and challenges facing the development and advancement of autonomous vehicles across the globe. And that report looks at 7 countries, the US, including state by state, along with Australia, Canada, China, Germany, New Zealand, and the UK. And the report focuses on 5 key areas. 1, the regulatory landscape. 2, driverless vehicle testing and deployment. 3, liability. 4, the data privacy and security that comes with that. And then finally, telecommunication and 5G. So that full report gives an in-depth look in each of those topics in each country. So I thought it would be incredibly cool to dive a little bit deeper into the legal responsibilities and the legal implications of autonomous vehicles. So I invited Eric Tannenblatt, Global Chair of Public Policy and Regulation and the leader of Denton's Autonomous Vehicle Group, back onto this podcast to discuss that report further. So I cordially invite you to come and join me and Eric in conversation right now. So a massive warm welcome back to the show, Eric. For anyone that has missed our previous conversation, can you just remind the listeners a little about who you are and what you do?
Sure. I am the Global Chair of Public Policy and Regulation at Dentons. Dentons, as some listeners may know, is the world's largest law firm. And the focus of my practice is in the public policy and regulatory space. But as part of that, I also lead a global autonomous vehicle practice group at the firm. That doesn't just include members of the public policy and regulatory team, but includes members across various practice groups at our firm that touch the autonomous vehicle ecosystem.
And like you said, Dentons is the world's largest law firm, but many people, I think, especially people listening, wouldn't automatically associate you with autonomous vehicles. So can you tell me a little bit more about the kind of work Dentons are performing in this space at the moment?
Sure. Well, we've obviously have been expanding our global footprint to, provide legal coverage across the world, but we're very focused on innovation. And that has been a central part of my practice, as well as several others throughout the firm. And in particular, I have been working with disruptive industries that are changing lives, people across the world. And it's particularly relevant in the public policy space because disruptors often go up against established industries that have legal and political protections. And we like to use our capabilities to break down the barriers for innovation. And there's general interest, taking that interest in disruption, it led me to start our Denton's Global Autonomous Vehicle Group about 3 years ago. And as I indicated earlier, it's a cross-practice group that includes lawyers with a wide variety of experience, including telecommunications, liability, insurance, data privacy, to name a few. And we work with technology companies, auto manufacturers, governmental entities and provide advice and counsel on the rollout and integration of autonomous technology and how it's going to impact our lives.
And that's one of the reasons I was excited to get you back on the podcast today, especially after hearing about the Global Guide to Autonomous Vehicles in 2020, which I believe takes a look at the top issues and challenges facing the development and advancement of autonomous vehicles, not just in the US, but worldwide. So can you give me a little background on that report?
Sure. Well, there's nothing that we're aware of that exists that looks at what is happening in the autonomous vehicle space on a global basis. And so the purpose of our report was to provide our clients and industry leaders with an understanding of what the global and regulatory environment looks like in the major AV markets around the world. And we have the footprint which allows us, we're uniquely positioned to provide expert insight into the industry globally. So the report that you referenced, it covers Australia, Canada, China, Germany, New Zealand, the UK, and the United States. And in particular, in the United States, we actually break it down into all 50 states. And the information in the report was all researched and curated by our in-country lawyers and professionals. Each section was led by a local country team and reflects not only the state of affairs as it stands today, but also includes predictive analysis by those who have intimate knowledge of the political and regulatory climate on the ground.
So if we begin, I'd love to have a look at that regulatory landscape that you mentioned there, especially in the report. So what did the report reveal around that area? Are you seeing any progress? And most importantly of all, are you seeing any acceptance in this industry too?
Very good question. Well, in the countries that we studied, there's certainly progress. I mean, each country has facilitated a process addressing testing of autonomous vehicles on public roads. Of course, the process varies across countries, but it's clear that governments are well aware that the technology is developing rapidly. And that being said, in the grand scheme of world regulations, we looked at these 7 countries that we thought were cutting edge. I mean, certainly most of Western Europe, North America, and the Far East, South Korea, China, Japan, they're prepared. But, if you ask about the rest of the world, how is this technology going to be leveraged, say, in Africa or South or Central America? I mean, these are questions that we still don't have answers for. But, in the countries where, in the countries that are developed, the technology is moving, and it's moving very, very quickly.
So the next natural step, I would imagine, a little bit like the world of IT, is going to be around driverless vehicle testing and then deployment. Is there anything else you can share about that kind of area that was revealed in the report?
Sure. I mean, well, driverless vehicle testing is fairly widespread in the developed nations. I mean, here in the United States, where I sit, AV companies have racked up millions of miles of testing on public roads over the last few years. State governments in the United States have been fairly permissive in terms of how and when you can test, especially, we have some states that have really stepped out in terms of making it a lot easier or welcoming, states like Arizona, California, Colorado, among others. But the same also goes in other countries like China, Germany, Canada. What is less clear is vehicle deployment, because there is enough concern among the public and lawmakers as to the safety of the vehicles. I mean, that continues to be an issue. And what we know when you start talking about widespread deployment, and whether it's robo taxis or utilization of autonomous vehicles for delivery, That's a little bit further off. And there are concerns that arise, when you're talking about one trained test driver in a test vehicle, versus a fleet of hundreds of connected vehicles that are transporting average citizens at one time. So this is where, like in the United States, for example, the federal government's likely to step in and put in place some consumer protections, cybersecurity requirements, and that's being addressed in our Congress right now. But back to your question about testing, I think you're probably seeing an increased amount of testing in jurisdictions all over the globe.
And when talking about driverless cars, like you said, it is important to remember it's much, much bigger than those long roads that people are testing their vehicles in Arizona. Well, it's also a hot topic in Australia, Canada, China, Germany, New Zealand, and the UK. So what did the report find about attitudes towards safety, liability, and privacy across all those regions?
Well, in terms of safety, as it relates to, say, testing, everyone is generally on the same page. I mean, certainly there's variations, especially, as you look at human drivers overseeing the vehicle. But in general, around the world, the safety of the vehicle during testing is placed squarely on the manufacturer, who's ever manufactured the vehicle. I mean, and liability is not a settled topic. I mean, there are several different approaches to who would be held accountable in the event of a crash, and that discussion will continue to unfold as the level of automation increases. So, for example, for semi-autonomous vehicles, meaning vehicles that can drive themselves under specific conditions, highways, good conditions, et cetera. I mean, who is responsible for turning off the, say, autopilot feature? If the owner of the vehicle is misusing the feature, are they liable? How much education is required to ensure drivers have a full understanding of the technology? I mean, these are tough questions that need to be answered and will likely play out in courts in the next 100 years or so. And privacy is also a developing question as it relates to autonomous vehicles. I mean, obviously, the GDPR in Europe applies to much of the data that will be collected by autonomous vehicles, and we're continuing to see U.S. states mirror those regulations, like, for example, in California. But there are significant troves of information that autonomous vehicles are going to have the ability to collect, especially when they're deployed in major fleets. I mean, they're going to be able to know, where you go, with whom, how long you stay. And so the question becomes, how is that information regulated? And, how is it going to be utilized, and what protections will there be? And other countries, through the GDPR or similar regulation, have generally staked out a position and simply need to apply, that law to the new technology. I think the U.S. is probably a little further behind in this area.
And like you say, data privacy is a very big topic at the moment, along with security as well. And as regards data privacy and security, was there anything in the report that surprised you at all, or was it mostly what you'd already aware and imagined?
Well, I talked a little bit about the privacy, but the security is a major issue, especially in the case of fleets, robo fleets. If you look at that, I mean, this is currently being considered, as I mentioned earlier, in legislation that is being currently discussed in the U.S. Congress. I mean, the legislation that they're looking at as it relates to cybersecurity sets out a number of requirements that automakers are going to have to, meet to protect vehicles against cybersecurity risks. But there's still some division among the authors of the bill on one major point, and that's whether the requirements would apply to all motor vehicles or only those designated at certain levels of automation. because as you know, there's different levels of automation. So I would say that cybersecurity is probably the issue of most concern for policymakers and the one with the least amount of guidance to date.
And there is also a huge anticipation around 5G at the moment. So what's that going to mean for the autonomous car industry, do you think?
Well, the widespread deployment of 5G will be a major boon to the autonomous vehicle industry. I mean, the increased speed of communications between vehicles, infrastructure, road users, that's going to push the upper bound of what these vehicles can do. So constant communication in real time will allow every vehicle to have accurate locational information on every vehicle, which in time could remove the need for stop signs, lights, because the vehicles will be able to talk to one another. Now, of course, it's a long time off, but without the speed of 5G, it would be impossible. And when I say a long time, a long time today is not as long as a long time 25 years ago. I always like to harken back to, I think it was a McKinsey study back in the late 80s that said, by the end of the century, 900,000 people would have cell phones, and it ended up being 200 million. So, today technology is moving at a really rapid pace.
It really is. And if we were to zoom out, what were the big takeaways from that global autonomous vehicle report? Was there anything there that particularly excited you?
Well, one area that doesn't get talked about enough that I'm excited about is that autonomous vehicles, if used properly, can lead to transit equity. By leaning into mobility as a service, vehicle travel will become less expensive, allowing more people to quickly and efficiently get to where they need to go, get to work, transport their children, have access to better health care. And there are key points for each country that were also raised. Like, for example, Australia, they require significant investment to upgrade its infrastructure, including communications and data access, as we were talking about earlier. Some municipalities in Australia are actively working toward this effort and have defined plans of action and budgets. In Ontario, Canada, they're leading testing and deployment of AV technology, while the federal government of Canada is focused more on ensuring consistency across all jurisdictions. We discovered, in the report, it talks about how the Chinese government has taken multiple steps to prepare national infrastructure for autonomous vehicles, including, defining action plans, publicly soliciting opinions on strategy, promoting research, and preparing the streets for autonomous transit. In Germany, they've established a national strategy for AVs, but its federal structure may threaten consistency at throughout the country. In New Zealand, we report that the government's encouraging the testing of semi and fully autonomous vehicles, as well as other transport technologies and innovations to facilitate the early adoption of the technology. And then recognizing the communications framework and how essential it will be, the UK has developed a focused strategy to become a global leader in 5G technology, including spectrum allocation. So, I can go on and on and on. We uncover a lot. There's a lot happening in the space, but that's just a good sampling of some of the items.
Absolutely. And I'm conscious we have only scratched the surface of some of the valuable information in that report. So for people listening that would like to find out more about that great work that you're doing, get a copy of the report or maybe contact your team, could you point them in the direction of where they can get that information?
Sure. We've made it very easy for people. You go to the Driverless Commute. I'll repeat that, thedriverlesscommute.com. And if you go to the driverlesscommute.com, you can download our Denton's Global Autonomous Vehicle Report. We also have a blog that has some really interesting information that our lawyers and professionals are constantly posting about things that are happening in the space. And then we have a running news feed that will allow you to see what's happening in the autonomous vehicle space in real time on a global basis. So again, it's the driverlesscommute.com. And there's also a way to contact me through that at eric.tannenblatt@dentons.com.
Excellent. Well, I'll add that URL to the Driverless Commute over on the blog post that will accompany this podcast episode. But more than anything, I've really enjoyed getting you back on here. It's an incredibly exciting space. And like I said, there is so much great information in that report. So a big thank you, Eric, for taking the time to come back on the podcast and share some of that information with me today.
Well, thank you very much. And hopefully we'll have a chance to visit again in the future.
Big thank you to Eric for explaining the findings and research in that report, and also for sharing his expert opinion on what it will take to get autonomous vehicles on the road, not only in the US, but globally. And I also hope for everyone listening, it's made you think a little bit differently about the legal world and ultimately your responsibilities when it comes to implementing new shiny tech solutions all over the world. And if you're a business leader, a tech professional, or even work in the legal profession, I'd love to hear your take on today's conversation. And if there's any points that you think we missed that we should have raised today, or the words resonated with you in any way, please let me know. I'm the easiest guy in the world to reach. Email me directly, techblogwriter@outlook.com. My website is techblogwriter.co.uk. You'll find interviews. You'll find over 1,100 interviews there, as well as learning how to work with me. If a daily tech podcast is not enough for you, yes, you can work with me too. And equally, if you just want to follow me on social media, LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, @NeilCHughes. All I ask, though, is you don't hit that follow or connect button. Send me a quick message so I know who you are, that you listen to the podcast. Generally enjoyed today's conversation, and I hope you did too. It's time for me to get out of here, though. I'll be back again tomorrow with another guest, so thanks for listening as always. And until next time, don't be a stranger.
Thank you for listening to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast with Neil C. Hughes. Remember, technology works best when it brings people together.